I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. Like I said, today we're going to be talking to Lee Boyce. Lee is a strength coach and educator based in Toronto, Canada. If you're interested in fitness or strength training at all, you've likely seen his work in some of the largest publications in the world. We're talking about National Strength and Conditioning Association's Personal Training Quarterly, Men's Health, Inside Fitness, T Nation, Oxygen, Shape, the list goes on and on. Basically, if there's a publication talking about fitness or strength training, Lee has probably been a contributor. So, like I say, he's here today to talk about his latest contribution, and that is strength training for all body types, the science of lifting and levers. So yeah, welcome, Lee. How are you doing today?
Doing good. I got a workout in earlier this morning and had canceled in the morning, so it gave me a little bit of more free time.
That's the nature of the business, right?
That's right. And so I worked out in, and then I had some breakfast, and so here we are now. I was able to make sure that I have my copy in front of
Very good.
Also,
very good.
Talk all about it.
Awesome. So I want to lead by giving everyone a little bit of perspective on where you're coming from. So if at first I find it hard to believe that people joining us might not know who you are, but tell us like how you got into strength training, how you got into writing, and really how you got to where you are today.
So I guess it started when I was 20 years old or so. I mean, it started well before that when I was a sprinter in university. I was a long jumper in university, and I was studying psychology. And I got into that field just because of the fact that I was very into sports, and I was an athlete who competed. And when I learned there was a program called Exercise Science that you could actually study like things that surround this subject, I was thrilled. So I got into it from high school and then into university, coinciding with me running track. And then when I was 20 years old, I got my first job as a personal trainer at a commercial gym. And that's sort of where the snowball started to roll. After my third or fourth year in the industry, I had a real goal of wanting to start contributing to a lot of the places I was studying from. And I wanted to be one of the people who was also giving information. And I had a lot of good ideas. And luckily, I was fortunate enough to have somebody, one of the editors for T Nation, which is the first place that I ever wrote for, and give me some kind of feedback on my pitches, and eventually accept one of those pitches. And I just wanted to make a point of not being just a one article wonder on one of those. And so I was pretty determined to continue writing, and opportunities came around from there after I got that, and it sort of went from there.
Okay, awesome. Like you mentioned, you wrote for T Nation. That was one of your first articles. Now, I did see in one of your articles, I think it was all the way back in 2013, that you mentioned that you were a tall guy as a teen, of course, but you didn't want to be known as the tall guy. You wanted to be the tall and big guy. Now, relating to that, like when did you realize that as someone with maybe longer limbs that you might have to lift or move or exercise differently than maybe some of your friends?
So just for reference for anyone who's watching, I'm 6'4", so I'm a taller lifter for sure. And I think that the point at which I really realized would have probably been like well into my 20s. I'd say my mid-20s or so.
Okay.
I was always aware athletically that there were some advantages and disadvantages depending on the sport of being taller, longer, levered. I was a sprinter, like I said, in university, and I know that I won a lot of races in high school, let's say. And so in high school, I know that every single race that I won in the 100 or 200 meters, I won from behind. And that was shorter lever equals a faster frequency, and therefore my starts wouldn't be as fast as the shorter athlete starts were, but I'd catch them and pass them toward the end. And so with that being said, like it wasn't quite an advantage to be too tall or too long for an event like a 100-meter dash compared to maybe a 400 where you have a chance to open up your stride and so on. So relating that to the gym now, it's not that I was able to bridge the gap so easily because it really depended much more on exercises in question. So, by the time I was 25, 6, I was realizing, okay, you know what? Like, yeah, these squats, I am hinging forward a little bit more than I should be probably. And it is harder for me to reach a certain depth with my squat. And my deadlift is like, I feel a lot of lower back when I do my deadlift, but my form up okay, my back's flat. So it was a little bit of a self-discovery, and you know, more looking into it showed me that, yeah, you know what, there are differences depending on anthropometry and leverages and the size and height of the individual. And that's when I started, you know, discussing these things through writing. It didn't take too long before, you know, by the time I was 27, 28, 29, I was writing about it, speaking about it, doing more investigations about it, looking for research on it, and realizing that it's a corner of the industry that hasn't really been touched too much.
Right, right. And I think I completely agree there. You mentioned that you are 6'4". Want to go to the cover of the book with your co-author. And I mean, just looking at this, I mean, this looks like the perfect combo with you and Melody. Just the different sizes, different body types. So I don't want to go too much further without giving a little bit of credit to her too, as a co-author in this book. When did you meet Melody, and like what was that relationship like? Maybe what perspective did you get from working with her? And I guess when did you realize that you're going to write a book together?
So we met in 2019 at the Kansas City Fitness Summit. I was speaking as part of the one of the people on the symposium there, and when I was giving my talk, I needed some volunteers, and so she actually she came up and volunteered for one, and she was giving a talk before that as well, but she volunteered. One of the people who was helping me out for one of the exercises I was showing with the TRX. So after that, we kind of just hit it off throughout the entire course of that weekend, and we were talking, joking around, and like we just developed quite a good friendship in a very short time. And then it was just a matter of, we stayed in touch. When I went back to Toronto and she went back to Pasadena, stayed in touch. We kept on sending each other messages and whatnot, and eventually a post on Instagram here that was about the juxtaposition of our sizes and how they related to how long it took to do an exercise, a rep or a set or so on. So we both did snatches, we both did deadlifts, and it showed that I was finishing well after her using similar tempos, right? And so yeah, it was a post that went really, really well. And after that, like, you know what, we should do more of this content. And then she was like, well, why don't we write a book? And then you know what? Yeah, maybe we should. And that's where, and from then it was, you know, she was a really, really instrumental in, first of all, she made the initial pitch to Human Kinetics first and foremost. And she was instrumental in a lot of the subjects in this book that especially deal with like physics and the research side of things and so on. So it was a really, really good blend, good combination. Plus it just worked well because, you know, at my height being 6'4", her height being 5 feet on the nose, my body size being a larger body size, hers being a little bit more of a petite body size, her being female, me being male, all of that stuff was making for the perfect kind of like, you know, yin to the yang, for lack of a better term, to make this a pretty all-encompassing book with a lot of perspectives in it.
Okay. What do you think that you learned most? I mean, you've had a lot of experience training, you know, training yourself. But what do you think you learned most from working with her and maybe gaining some of that perspective?
I would say that first and foremost, like just looking at things like the issues like small hands, like we talk about in the book, or things that involve more locomotive training, strongman work, and grip strength work, and all kinds of arm lifting. These are things that she specializes in especially. And so whereas that's not my forte, what I heard from her in terms of where advantages and disadvantages come depending on body size for those kinds of disciplines, that was very eye-opening to me, and it expanded my breadth of knowledge, to be honest with you.
Okay. I want to go back to what you mentioned about when you guys were demonstrating those exercises. Maybe it was your dumbbell snatch or whatnot. Can you go back to a little bit more of that feedback of kind of like how those exercises look differently for both of you? Because I think that's one of the things, the biggest things that I recognize in, I mean, you might look at someone, maybe your size 6'4", doing a squat compared to someone, maybe her size 5 feet. And you could be doing the same exercise, but it's going to look a little differently.
For sure. So first of all, just from a time perspective, it's going to take longer, and it's going to be more work for the taller and longer levered individual with all things equal. If we're going to do a squat together, and I'm going to go down to my rock bottom, which is full range of motion, and she's going to go down to her rock bottom, full range of motion, then more work being performed by the longer lever because of the fact that there's going to be a force times distance equation and there's longer distance, you know. And so with that being said, that's the first thing that needs to be sort of acknowledged. Now, as far as what differences in geometry or body angles that are created in order to do this, there's going to be maybe a whole lot more of a need for greater dorsiflexion for someone like me to achieve same range of motion relative to somebody like her, because maybe her legs are shorter, maybe her torso is longer even relative to her own body. And so for that reason, her knees don't have to travel too far as forward. And she's going to still get that congruency between her torso angle and her shin angle to get that proper squat looking. Yeah. And me, you know, in order for me to get the same congruency, I'm going to have a much more deep shin angle relative to the floor, relative to my foot, just because of the length of my femur and because of the length of my leg relative to my torso. So all of those kinds of things are going to definitely influence the way that a squat looks and how differently a squat could appear depending on who is doing the squat, and why we shouldn't be using blanket cues and the same kind of over the top coaching principles rather than thinking about things on an individual basis. And that has to do with things like foot width, stance, toe position, all that sort of stuff really falls into that category of it kind of depends, and it depends on the individual and the lifter.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned cues. I did want to bring that up. It reminded me of a post that I made myself of an athlete that I had been training for a while. He was, at the time, he was in 8th grade, about 6'4", and we were really proud of the progress that he had made on his barbell squats. But in the video, you could see, you know, his knees kind of going forward a little bit more, and that was completely natural for him. But of course, that got comments, you know, knees aren't supposed to go over your toes, like, well, what are you doing? All that type of stuff. So can you talk maybe a little bit more about like how important those cues are, and how, you know, again, how a squat might look different. It might not look, I guess, like the stereotypical squat that we think that every squat should look like.
Yeah, so in the case of the squat, blanket cues like feet being shoulder width apart or the knees going over the toes being a bad thing, these are things that we have to eliminate from the trainer's vocabulary, the trainer's school of thought. And, you know, I understand the intent of statements like that for a very, very complete beginner who doesn't understand how to move, because they can be cues that can get somebody in the right frame of mind to keep their heels down, for example, and not come up off the heels. That's a principle that every strength coach out there is going to agree upon, that it's not the greatest idea for a good quality squat. Now, having said that, when you're talking about things from a little bit more than just a complete beginning perspective, now we got to look closer at things like knees over toes, look closer at things like feet shoulder width apart, and see that depends on the individual. For the hip position or the hip anatomy of the individual, it might warrant a wider stance, or it might warrant a narrower stance. It might warrant that the knees are going to point in the direction of the toes that might be a little bit out this way versus a little bit more forward. All these things are going to be very, very based on the testing and the trial and error that you do with the client in order to get that proper information so that you can make the proper prescription program-wise. As far as knees over toes, this is something that it might not be as necessary depending on the body type for certain individuals, but for a lot of individuals, it'll be 100% necessary when the goal is to get a certain amount of depth or break parallel or go all the way down or whatever have you. You know, in my case, for example, there's no chance that I'm going to squat without my knees passing my toes unless that squat is extremely shallow. And if I tried to go deep without my knees passing my toes, I would stumble backwards. So it really, instead of thinking about things from what the body must be made to do, we should think about it in terms of what the bar should be made to do. In any vertical pushing or pulling exercise, we want the idea for the bar to travel in generally a straight line, at least staying within your footprint when it goes up and down. So that goes true for the deadlift, goes true for the overhead press, goes true for the squat pattern as well, right? And so when we go down into the bottom of the squat position, if that bar can maintain itself within our footprint, our body's going to have to conform and have the mobility and flexibility to get down to that certain point without that happening. If not, what we see, okay, so I force my knees to stay behind my toes, fine. When I go down, the bar is still going to stay inside my footprint, but my butt's going to be way out there. My back is going to flat, and I'm not going to be able to achieve the depth that I need. I'm going to be neglecting a whole bunch of muscle groups at the same time. So just because of what my proportions are sort of shoehorning me into in terms of a biomechanics perspective, I got to sort of accommodate that by way of making sure that I reference the bar and use the right body geometry and get mobile enough, of course, to achieve the right positions. So these are the things that we have to all think about, not only as lifters, but as coaches too with our clients.
Okay, very cool. One thing that I've heard you or read you, I guess, write about, talk about quite a bit is, how it is, I guess, easier sometimes for maybe someone that is maybe a little shorter or shorter limbs to lift a heavier weight, or maybe do like an Olympic lift, something like that. I know you've referenced specifically like CrossFitters might do a much better job at some events where they might be more difficult at other events. Can you speak to that a little bit and how not just lifting, but athletically, the size or type of your body is going to change what you can do?
Yeah, that's really loaded because on the one side, there's talking about things like CrossFit, for example. There's a reason why the majority of CrossFit winners or champions or elite level CrossFitters who are always placing at the CrossFit Games and so on, they're not the tallest individuals. They're not the longest limbed individuals either. If you take a look at their body types, you'll see that it becomes a little bit more homogeneous. And that same goes true for a lot of other sports at the elite level too. If you look at a cross-section of NFL running backs, or you look at a cross-section of 200-meter sprinters versus 100-meter sprinters versus 400-meter sprinters. If you look at gymnasts at that level, swimmers, you can go on and on. And that just goes to show that in order for it to speak to the performance requirements of that sport, you're going to have at some point the body type that's conducive to it. Now, it doesn't mean that other body types can't do it, but there's probably going to be a little bit of a lower ceiling in terms of just how far they're going to be able to go, what they're going to be able to achieve compared to people who might have the ideal body type or proportions for it. So talking about the CrossFit thing, what I do want to say is that this is a games where the goal is to do X amount of work against the clock, right? And since you're racing time, and that's a big factor, we start thinking about that whole work situation again, force times distance, and we think about the fact that if there's a greater distance that something has to travel, that means that there's going to take more time to do that thing. And so that's going to probably hamstring you a little bit in terms of getting the fastest time for doing, let's say, 100 kettlebell snatches from bottom to top when you've got this great distance to travel and so on with this amount of weight. So that being said, there's going to be, and in the case of like Olympic lifting as well, a lot of Olympic lifters are going to have those longer torsos so they can squat down much more easily without having to contort their bodies too much or get down really low with a huge knee change in the knee positioning. And then as far as getting that weight from the torso up overhead, it's a shorter distance with shorter arms to do that versus having to travel all the way up with a foot longer of reach. So these are the sort of practical ways, or the ways in practice or in action, that you can see that, the body type will kind of match the sport after a certain level of elitism is achieved anyway. Okay. So, it's not to say that the 6'4" lifter can't go and do cleans or snatches. I love those exercises myself. But what risk are we incurring by maybe adding the same amount of volume as somebody who might be a little bit more built for these exercises? What risk are we incurring when we add a certain amount of weight to the bar that we might be able to muscle up, but maybe there's a little bit more risk because of the size of the lever arms and those moment arms that are going to have to deal with at the same time? So they're good pieces of food for thought and things that we should be thinking about 100% when we're programming for our clients or when we're programming for ourselves, what we choose to do and how we choose to do it.
Okay. Is there, I guess, speaking to that, is there ever a time when you would say specifically, maybe this exercise isn't for you, maybe we should move on to a different modification or a completely different exercise to work those same muscles?
Yeah, 100%. And that's what's literally contained throughout the entire book from chapter to chapter. It just explores a lot of different variations that might better suit a certain body type. And we have 13 body types that we go over, including the long arms, the short legs, the long torsos, the short torsos, and so on. Small hands is another one. These are all things that are explored depending on the lift, especially in terms of what it would pertain to. So what are you going to do if you want to do an overhead press, but you have long arms? What are you going to do if you want to do a bench press, but you have a pair of pair of short legs, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
All these different combinations get explored lift to lift, and finding the right variation to properly service the individual is going to be the best way to go about it, and it's the smartest way to go about it, so that, okay, you know what, maybe we're not standardizing the conventional barbell deadlift, or we're not doing the conventional back squat, like is what is very commonly coached or are told to do. They're popular exercises, but it doesn't mean it's the right choice for you. So maybe I've got clients who will be making their PR search or their PR chase or their 3-rep max chase with a trap bar lift instead of a barbell. Maybe we don't touch the barbell. Maybe for myself, I prefer using the front squat exercise as my primary squat go-to compared to the back squat, and so on and so forth. So finding those variations is extremely important, and that's something that this book very much emphasizes.
Awesome. Can you speak to maybe specifically some of those modifications? I guess some of the best modifications that you could recommend for some people. I know I actually saw a video on your Instagram. I don't know if you posted it today or yesterday, where you were, demonstrating the Nordic hip hinge,
Yep.
which I thought was a great way to, still work the hamstrings, still work the glutes in that way, but maybe that's a good alternative for someone that can't do a different exercise.
Yeah, so that one right there I actually like so much because of the fact that, when you're a bigger body, when you're a heavier body and so on, the typical GHR or Nordic curl or eccentric Nordic curl, it can place a lot of stress on the back. It can give you some posterior knee strain. It can give you some ligament issues. It could give you some tendon attachment discomfort. And that's the feedback that I've gotten over the years. And even personally, I've noticed that when I'm doing that exercise. Now, it doesn't mean it happens all the time, but it does happen. And so how do we sort of mitigate this? What do we do in order to sort of counter this? And so I like that hinging exercise because you're holding more of an isometric position at the bottom side, but on the top side, you get to use the hamstrings as hip extensors. So it's a smart move. So that different cues and different modifications to movements like that is where this book goes. So in the case of, let's say, a squat pattern, right? I talked about front squats and being a nice pivot from the regular squat as well. So what about something like somebody who doesn't have great shoulder mobility, somebody who's big all over? That's one other body category that we have in there. Someone who's big all over might have a lot of muscle, or they might just have a lot of size overall. And so in getting that bar back, or getting the hand back on the bar like this in order to get a back squat in there, or even having the mobility to do a clean grip for the front squat, might not be something that's comfortable or even doable at all. So what do? Well, we could start making adjustments to the equipment that we use. Maybe we look Archer hold, maybe we look at a safety bar squat, maybe we look at something like that. There are even makeshift versions of safety bars if somebody doesn't have that equipment. What kinds of things can we do in order to make these movements possible for an individual and get the benefits of the movement? I didn't put it in the book, but another one is a great one is a Hatfield squat too, using a safety,
Okay.
using the hands on the railing of the bar itself. These are all great ideas and modifications and pivots from the normal programming that people usually use to the death. And, personally, I think that those modifications should get a little bit more attention. And if that's what you use for your measurement of your max efforts or your 3-rep max or your 5-rep max, then great. It's just a new frame of reference.
Great. Another one, while you were just talking about the squat, another really common one that I see issues with too is obviously the deadlift. Now, I know trap bar deadlift is considered maybe a safer alternative to a straight bar deadlift in a lot of cases. But what are some other modifications that people might be able to make, whether that's, putting plates up on blocks or, maybe even doing like a depth deadlift, something like that?
Yeah, the medium sumo stance comes to first mind there. As far as if all you've got is a deadlift, and maybe you don't even have anything to elevate that bar on because you're lacking mobility and you don't have the range of motion you need for your back to stay the proper way, then people will say, okay, go high trap bar. Well, what if you don't have one or your gym's using one right now? Don't have a chance to use a trap bar. Well, then how about going to the medium sumo stance where you're deadlifting from essentially your squatting stance with your hands inside your legs instead of outside? All of a sudden, that gives you a chance to keep your torso up a little bit taller, gives you a chance to drop your seat a little bit more so your spine gets to stay taller, and that means that you're going to have less shear forces on your lower back. And so from that, it makes somebody much more able to, achieve the right positions and get into the right starting point and make the lift a little bit safer. I've had a lot of clients who've made that pivot, and they usually feel really good, and they can usually get the form a lot more easily. On the flip side, so that's for a lot of taller lifters especially, they really like that. So on the flip side, if you've got a shorter lifter and it's like 3 inches from the bottom to top for the deadlift, they might be like, okay, so like, how can I, make this harder? How can I create more challenge or get more time under tension? Usually they're not going to have too many issues with mobility when they're having to reach down not too far to get to that bar. So into like a deficit deadlift position might be a smart place to go for them, where they're standing on a platform and they're pulling still from the floor so that that bar is traveling a longer distance from bottom to top. And those kind of modifications can be really, really important and really, really useful. We talk about things like bar thickness as well, men's bars, women's bars, and the amount of millimeters that is, and whether smaller people with smaller hands might benefit either way from doing stuff with a men's bar where they have a little bit more surface area, or stuff with a women's bar where they have a better chance to grip this thing. So what the goals of the individual are, whether they're trying to train the grip, whether they're trying to get the most performance, but those are other things to pay attention to and keep in mind. A lot of gyms don't really realize, especially commercial gyms, don't really realize those differences in terms of what they're ordering shipment-wise, in terms of the bars that they're looking for, and whether there is even such a thing as a deadlift bar versus a bench press bar versus a squatting bar, because there are, and how they differ. Where's the knurling? How heavy? How much flex is in the bar? All those kinds of things play a huge role in terms of what your performance is going to be when you start wanting to take things to the next level.
For someone that maybe isn't as knowledgeable as some of these, maybe they're not a trainer or a coach, just a consumer wanting to find a way to modify their exercises, what are some things that they can look for in that equipment? Like maybe they're just not as knowledgeable about the equipment, but they still want to do some of those exercises.
Well, I think that having a little toolbox of kind of aids or additional things in your gym bag or backpack could be a first thing to help. I like having a pair of straps so that you can attach those to a barbell to make front squats easier, for example. And that's something we talk about too, where if you don't have the mobility to get down there for a clean grip and the California style doesn't feel too comfortable and not really as safe, then we can grab the straps and you can hold onto those straps while you do your front squats. It's a really good alternative. We talk about those Angles 90 grips, and they're over in my gym bag. I grab them for a second. But the Angles 90 grips, or grips that you can attach to a bar that allows you to rotate your hands to make a movement like a row or a pull-down pattern feel a little bit smoother. If somebody doesn't have the mobility or the wrist mobility to properly supinate when they're doing chin-ups like this, it can really, really be hard on the wrists and be hard on the elbows as well. And so having the opportunity to swivel those pivoting handles as you're going through your chin-up, it's a really, really great way, and it's a great way to substitute gymnastic rings if your gym doesn't have that either, right? And so these are all kind of little tools and little tricks that I like to sort of implement myself. I use everything that I just talked about myself, and it's something that I recommend for a lot of clients. And I'm a pretty mobile guy, and there's a lot of people who aren't mobile, and so for the people who I train who have these, it's very, very handy.
Okay. What in your entire career, and specifically pertaining to this topic right here, what is maybe the biggest thing that surprised you, whether it's research that you've done or a personal anecdotal experience? What is maybe the biggest thing that surprised you in all this?
I think what surprised me the most looking into subjects like this is the fact that not only was this not a charted territory for the industry, there's really not much literature that's out there on the subject, if any. Definitely no books on it or anything like that. But I think what surprised me is the amount of fixed programming, the amount of programming and information that's being given that doesn't ask additional questions to the lifter, like what their starting point is, what their body type is, what their injury history is, whether they've had surgeries, what their training age is, what their real age is, and whether or not the workouts should change based on those things. I'm a person, admittedly, who prefers to train without a program than somebody who prefers to train on a program, and I've had plenty of experience with both sides of the coin. Because of the fact that I like to train without a program these days, it's allowing me to train more intuitively and practice a lot of the different components of fitness, like agility, like coordination, reaction time, strength, power, speed, all those things, the other 5 that I haven't mentioned as well. And so that's I like to train the way that I do these days. Having said that, when I do find a program, or when I have found a program that is, a great program with a great set of workouts and a great structure to it, that program never asks, okay, well, what if you're a 65-year-old dude who's picked up this book and you want to follow this program? Is it the right fit for you? What if you're somebody who's had a double knee surgery, like me? Is this going to affect the way that you're going to approach the volume or the lifting percentages or anything like that are recommended in this book? What if you're somebody who's got a really long wingspan and it's asking for a whole lot of pressing in the program? How many times are you going to be able to do that without starting to feel those shoulders and so on, right? These are the questions that, okay, so you have a goal of wanting to have a stronger bench. That's great. That means you're probably going to have to do more benching. What are the ramifications for that decision? So these are the that I wished a lot of programs would kind of get into a little bit more, get a little bit deeper into in terms of, okay, you know what, if you're somebody who's of this body type or have this history or you've been suffering with this injury or whatnot, then you can pivot this way or shift the volume or trade the volume for these exercises instead. And, at least at the very end there, that last point of trading volume and substituting movements for other movements to make up some of the volume for the pattern in question, that's something we talk about in this book as well. There are a lot of different ways to do a hinge pattern and load a hinge pattern without having to barbell deadlift or even trap. There's the reverse hyper, there's a hip thrust, there's pull throughs, there's glute bridges, and so on and so forth. Just to name a few, the 45 or horizontal back extensions too. These are all movements that can still contribute to the same outcome in different ways.
Okay, great information there. And you might have already answered this, but I wanted to ask, what is the biggest takeaway that you would like people to take from this interview, from this book that you and Melody have put up?
We want to make sure that, just like the title says, strength training for all body types, it means that the book is not geared just toward trainers. It's not geared just toward lifters. It's not geared just toward beginners. It's for everybody. And there's definitely something that everybody can take away from this, because no matter if you're Bob from accounting, Deborah from finance, or the most elite hockey player on the planet, each of those people comes with their own body type. Right? And we always think about body type and leverages and anthropometry. And, the second part of this book's title is The Science of Lifting and Levers. So if you make it like it's some kind of an academic resource, which it is, but at the same time, it's got such a mainstream reach because those Bob from accountings and Deborah from finance people, these kinds of people as well, they all have differences in body geometry, body anatomy, body proportions, levers, and all that stuff. And they're going to use exactly the same kinds of principles of training to better themselves in the gym and train safely and reach their goals. So it's really something that's for everyone, regardless of skill level, regardless of what their abilities are, whatever their starting points are. And that's what makes it so unique and so great.
Great. Out of respect for your time, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. But definitely, if you're watching this, listening along, pick up a copy of this book. Like Lee just said, whether you are a trainer, a coach, whether you are just a gen pop person that wants to get better in their movements, wants to get better at certain lifts, and maybe you struggle a little bit, this is a great resource that is going to help you along with that, help you make modifications, help you get so much more out of your workout. So you can obviously get this at our website, us.humankinetics.com. And Lee, I will let you have the last word here. You can let everyone else know where else they might be able to get the book, and actually where to follow you and Melody to keep up with all the great work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, so first and foremost, you can follow us at, I'm at Coach Lee Boyce, so here on Instagram and across the other social media, Twitter, Facebook, I've got Coach Lee Boyce, and Melody's handle is 5 Feet of Fury 1. So you could follow her, and if that's too convoluted, then just search up my friends. She's one of my friends, of course, on social. You'll find her there. Having said that, finding this book, Amazon's going to have that as well. And today's the official release date, if I'm not mistaken, December 1st. Yeah. Now it's no longer on pre-order. You can order this thing. It's on Amazon. It's going to be there, and it's on barnesandnoble.com. It's going to be in stores at Barnes & Noble and Indigo up in Canada as well. So looking forward to seeing that on the shelves, and it's going to be circulating. So we're really hoping this thing makes a splash, and we want to really get things started off on the right foot.
Yeah, I really think it will. Like I said, it's a great resource, something that regardless of where you're at in your programming, where you're at in your life, you should definitely pick up a copy. You're going to get benefit from it. So again, thank you so much for your time, and keep up all the great work.
Thanks a lot. I'm glad to be on.